The Founders Podcast is in the top 0.1% of all the podcasts in the world. And today, I'm going to tell the story behind how it got there. I'm Tony Mastrorio. I'm the founder of PodCharm, a community platform that helps podcasters grow their audience. And today on the show, I'm discussing how the Founders Podcast got started, what makes it unique, and the strategies the host used to grow it into one of the top history and business podcasts out there. The goal of How Pods Grow is for us to learn the tactics, decisions, and even some of the lucky breaks that helped successful podcasters get to where they are today. And at the end, I'm also going to share how I'm applying some of these strategies to this show so you can see how I'm using what I'm learning from other creators. Let's start off with some context about the Founders Podcast, because you may or may not have heard of it before or listened to it. So each week, the host, he is a guy named David Senra. He reads a biography of a famous founder or pioneer throughout history. Then, in his podcast, he goes on and he shares interesting quotes from the book and all the fascinating stuff he learned about the person. Okay, so pretty simple. And here's what we know about David, the host. He graduated from the University of Central Florida. I actually don't know the exact year, but he looks fairly young. I'd guess he's in his 30s. As far as his professional experience, prior to starting Founders, he started a few different companies. He hasn't really discussed his companies in too much depth. I have heard him talk about them a little bit, but he only talks about what they did kind of vaguely. So I don't know too much about them or how successful they were. But if you look him up on LinkedIn, the only experience he has listed is that he's the founder of Founders Podcast. So I kind of get the impression that that's all he really wants to be known for. All right, I want to play a clip. Listen to what David says on the Danielle Newnham podcast about why he started Founders.
This is like, I like podcasting, I like reading, I like entrepreneurship, and I like history. So here's your question. I never started the podcast thinking that like it'd be what it is or like this is going to be what I did forever. It's like I was just obsessed with podcasts.
Okay, so he started it because he was thinking about all the things that interest him, and he found something at the intersection of all of them. He likes podcasting, he likes reading, he likes entrepreneurship, and he likes history. And David says his goal has always been to do something for work that he'd want to be doing, even if he wasn't getting paid for it, which is pretty cool. I mean, I think if we all could choose, that's what we'd like to be doing as well. Okay, so David started work on the Founders Podcast in September 2016. And at the time, he didn't have an audience. So he had no following on social media. And this was his first podcast and remains his only podcast. So he didn't come into it bringing a community from somewhere else. He had to grow it from scratch, which I think is great because most of us can relate to that. It's why we love stories about people who built big businesses and audiences starting from nothing because, most of us are in the same boat. So I think we can learn a lot from it. Okay, now I want to play a clip so you can get an idea of the format of the show, in case you haven't listened to it before. Listen to this. It's how he started episode 1 of his podcast, so the very first episode, which he did on a biography he read of Elon Musk.
While Musk has been anything but shy about what he was up to, few people outside of his companies got to see the factories, the R&D centers, the machine shops, and to witness the scope of what he was doing firsthand. Here was a guy who had taken much of the Silicon Valley ethic behind moving quickly and running organizations free of bureaucratic hierarchies and applied it to improving big, fantastic machines and chasing things that had the potential to be the real breakthroughs we've been missing. By rights, Musk should have been part of the malaise. He jumped into the dot-com mania in 1995 when, fresh out of college, he founded a company called Zip2, a primitive Google Maps meets Yelp. The first venture ended up a big, quick hit. Compaq bought Zip2 in 1999 for $307 million. This is something very few people know about Elon. They know about PayPal, they know about SpaceX, they know about Tesla, now they know about Solar City. They didn't know that when he was in his early 20s, he sold a company for $307 million.
So this is how he always starts his podcasts. He reads an interesting quote. Usually it's like 45 seconds to a minute long. And then he provides some commentary on the quote. And then throughout the episode, he alternates back and forth between reading quotes and providing interesting commentary, with his goal being to tell an engaging story about the person. Now, I want to pause there for a minute because a lot of times when we talk about advice for growing a podcast, we focus on the strategies that you can use and just assume that the content is great. And that's because really, if your content isn't great, all the rest of the stuff you do doesn't really matter. Producing great content that your audience will enjoy is kind of like the minimum bar. One way we can all produce better content is to get really good at storytelling. I'm always working on becoming a better storyteller. It's one of the things that David does when he pieces together his episodes. He tries to tell a compelling story. There are a lot of great resources out there on how to do it. There are YouTube videos, there are articles, but and you can consume as much of that as you want, but really it just takes a lot of practice. Okay, so as I mentioned, the concept behind Founders is incredibly simple. David talks, alternating between quotes and commentary for the entire episode. And he's built a huge audience just doing this. In every episode, it's just David talking. And I think this highlights two misconceptions that people have about podcasting. Number one is a lot of people think that you have to do interviews to have a successful podcast because there are so many interview shows out there. And the second misconception, people think that you need to have a co-host in order to have a successful podcast. Both of these things are not true. Since I started podcasting, I've actually had several people reach out to me and ask questions about starting their own podcast. And it's very common to hear people say, I just need to find someone to host it with me. And I'm here to tell you that that's not actually true. If that's all you're missing, it's just you really want to do a podcast and you don't have anybody to do it with you, don't let that stop you. David is just one example of this, but there are plenty of others out there. Some of my favorite shows are hosted by solo podcasters. Now, I will say it's a lot more work on the content side. You have to provide all the content yourself. If you're going it alone, you usually have to do a lot more research. And if you don't have guests and you don't have a co-host, you don't have that built-in like back and forth banter. And it's also just a different skill set to host a podcast on your own. In a way, it takes a lot more practice. You have to get good at talking to nobody or talking to the camera, which is not for everyone. I still struggle with that. It's something that I'm getting used to. But on the positive side, there are a lot of benefits to hosting a solo podcast. One is it requires no access to other people. So you don't need any connections to guests. You don't have to coordinate schedules or deal with logistics. It's just you. Okay, so this leads us to something else that's been instrumental to David's success. He puts a ton of effort and research into every episode. If you think about it, he has to read an entire biography every week, which, might be 500, 600, 800 pages long. And it's not even just the biographies. He's reading other sources. He's listening to other podcasts. He really wants to become an expert on the person that he's going to be talking about in his episode. Then he has to take the time to organize all his notes, compile them together, and then on the episode, he pieces them into that story that I was talking about, where he will read some of his favorite segments on the podcast and then provide some interesting commentary. And one of the things there is no substitute for is that his commentary includes a wealth of knowledge he's compiled reading all these books over the last several years. It is not uncommon for him to refer back to an episode he did like maybe 200 or 300 episodes ago. That's part of what makes him unique. And it's very difficult to replicate. And it's really, why his fans love him so much and why they listen. It's part of the value that he offers. Okay, moving on to some more tactical stuff. Let's start with the name of the podcast, Founders. I don't think most people know how important the name of their podcast is, or even, sometimes people don't know what makes a good podcast name. And if you think about podcasts from a listener's perspective, our available time to listen to podcasts is extremely limited. And getting into a new show can sometimes be a big investment and time commitment for people. So if your podcast name doesn't sound like something people would be interested in listening to, they're most likely not going to listen. And they won't even give it a second thought. People are scrolling through their feeds so quickly. If it doesn't catch their eye, or even if they hear about it, but it doesn't sound compelling to them, then they're most likely not going to listen. That's why Founders, I think, is such a great name for this particular podcast. It's both what the show is about, and it's also who the show is for, in a sense. It's about founders, but it's also for founders and for people who have been founders, maybe future founders, people who are into entrepreneurs, all of that sort of stuff, history. It's not a catchy title, but it's clear and concise, and you know what you're going to get. Now, I can hear people saying there are plenty of podcasts out there with names that are not clear and concise, and maybe they're more catchy. You don't really know what they mean, and that is true. It's not impossible to grow a podcast with a name like that, but it's a lot harder. And if you look at a lot of those podcasts, a lot of the popular podcasts like that are started by celebrities, and frankly, they already have a huge fan base who are going to listen to them and seek them out no matter what they call their podcast and what they talk about. It doesn't have to mean anything because people are tuning in to listen to the person. All right, now I want to play another short clip. This one's about 30 seconds, and it comes at the start of episode 3, which is about Thomas Edison. And I want to point out something that's unique about Founders compared to most other podcasts. Listen to this.
Having one's own shop, working on projects of one's own choosing, making enough money today so one could do the same tomorrow. These were the modest goals of Thomas Edison when he struck out on his own as full-time inventor and manufacturer. The grand goal was nothing other than enjoying the autonomy of entrepreneur and forestalling a return to the servitude of employee. Edison's need for autonomy was primal and unvarying. It would determine the course of his career from the beginning to the end.
Okay, that's the clip. Now, I mentioned before that the whole show is just David talking, and I meant that literally. That means there's something missing from Founders that's included in 99% of podcasts I listen to, probably every other podcast I listen to. I can't think of another one off the top of my head that doesn't have this, and that's intro music. And in fact, there are no sound effects at all throughout the entire podcast, because I think the reason is, David realizes that it doesn't matter for his audience. They just want to hear about all the interesting stuff that he learns from reading the books that he reads. That's why they're listening to him. That's the value that he's providing. They don't care about his sound effects or, having a catchy jingle in his podcast. And not everyone will like this, right? Some people want the music. Most podcasters include music in their podcasts. People want their podcasts to be more highly produced and polished. And music and effects can go a long way in helping with branding. So this isn't necessarily the best way to go. It's certainly not the only way to go. In my other podcast, we have these sound effects between segments. We have this upbeat intro and outro music. And people have told us that they really like the music. And when they start listening to it, it gets them excited to listen to the podcast. So, I think music can be great. But I think the important thing to realize is just that this is an option. And especially at the beginning, if you're just starting your podcast, it can often be the best option. And there's two important things to call out here. One is we all have limited time and resources, both as podcasters and as listeners. So we don't want to spend our time and resources focusing on the wrong things or the things that don't really matter. We just want to deliver value to our listeners. We can always add in music and sound effects later. It really does, it can take a long time to find the right music and the right sound effects for your show. And that can delay some people from getting started, or maybe even cause some people to not get started. When I started my other podcast, it took us probably a couple weeks to find all of that stuff for our podcast and settle on what we wanted to use. And, so if you want to get started without that, you certainly can. And the second thing that I wanted to call out is your podcast doesn't have to be liked by everyone. And in fact, it really shouldn't be liked by everyone. That's the idea behind finding a niche. Not everyone is into learning about founders, and that's okay. David isn't talking to all of the people. He's just talking to the people who are interested in learning about founders. Okay, so another thing David does on his show that's really simple, but different from most other podcasters, is that he doesn't speak to an audience. He speaks to an individual person. And I'll give you an example. This may sound subtle, but it's actually very calculated and intentional. He's talked about doing this on other podcasts. So the way that he does that is he never says things like, "Hey everyone," or "Hey guys," to make it sound like he's talking to an audience. Instead, he really sounds like he's talking to an individual person. He says things like, "Remember when you and I talked about Steve Jobs?" Which, is very subtle, but the first time I heard him do this, it kind of caught me off guard because I wasn't used to it. And so few people adopt this type of style. But I don't know, I kind of like it. I think maybe more people should try it out. I also want to say there are other very successful podcasters who intentionally adopt the complete opposite approach, and that works incredibly well for them. We'll talk about some of those people and why it works better for them specifically in a future episode. I already have at least one in mind. One of my favorite things about the founder's style of podcast and format is you have a limitless supply of material to make interesting episodes with. Think about how many biographies of great founders or pioneers throughout history there are. And there is a very large population of people who want to know the information in those books, but don't have the time or the ambition to spend their time reading it like David does. So that's the value that David is providing. He captured that was some value that he could provide for people, and he's doing it. Here's another lesson from David. Most creators give away their content for free, but not enough ask directly for something meaningful in return. Before getting into what David asks for, there are two important things here. Number one, you have to prioritize and be very specific about what you're asking for, because you can't ask for everything, and people need to know exactly what you want from them in order for your ask to be successful. And number two, you have to earn it by providing value first. David usually waits until the very end of his episodes, which can be great because you've already provided all of the value. But it may not be ideal because you may have already lost a significant chunk of your audience. A lot of people don't finish listening to all of a podcast episode. And this is where you really need to know your metrics. You need to know how long, on average, people listen to your show. You can find this information in your hosting platform. You can find it on Spotify for podcasters. You don't want to wait until the end of your episode to make your ask if you lose 90% of your audience by then. All right, so as far as what David asks for, there are a few different things that I've heard him ask for throughout his episodes. But if we go back to the beginning when he was starting and growing his podcast, David recognized that it's very important for a podcast's growth that it gets 5-star reviews on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. These are the most popular apps, and they can help drive a ton of new listeners. And most people generally don't go and leave reviews on their own. So if you look at shows that have a lot of reviews, it's most likely not because that many people just thought to go and leave a review for that show. You need to prompt them. So David actually does something very clever. Listen to this clip, and then I'll tell you some more about it.
If you want to support this podcast and you want to make it possible for me to make even more podcasts in the future on historically great figures, please consider subscribing to the Patreon. It's only $5 a month, and for that you'll get hours of entertainment every month. You can also support by leaving a review. Please leave a 5-star review in iTunes. How you do that, you go to your podcast app, you search for Historically Great, you click on that, and then it'll say leave a review. You can just leave 5 stars and save. It takes less than a minute. It helps spread this podcast to other people. The more positive reviews we get, the more likely you are to people are to see this when they're searching in the App Store for new podcasts.
In early episodes of the show, David offers to give some of the people who go and submit a 5-star rating and review of his podcasts on iTunes then a copy of the biography he read for that episode. And that fits very well in the context of his show. And it worked well for him at the beginning when not many people were listening. I think there are two other maybe secrets to success that we can draw from David's experience. Number one, just get started. David says this as well. Don't be afraid of sucking in the beginning. Whenever we start something new, especially, we have this tendency to compare ourselves to, not to the successful people back when they started. We're comparing ourselves to successful people now. So, the episode 500 version of somebody, not the episode 1 version of that person. And that's the person that we really should be comparing ourselves to. And in David's case, I can tell you, I've listened to several of the first episodes, like his early episodes of his podcast, and he doesn't sound nearly the same in some of those early episodes. His sound quality isn't as good. His equipment must not be as good. His editing is not as high quality. He fumbles for words more, but it really didn't matter for a couple of reasons. One, not too many people were listening. And two, I think he knew he was just putting in the reps to get better over time. Now when people go back and listen to those episodes, they understand he's already built this brand. So it's okay that it's expected that he wasn't as good at the beginning or things were a little bit different at the beginning. One thing that's true among nearly all creators is they wish they had started earlier. And the reason for this is that the value of your content compounds over time. So if you think about it, as far as the Founders Podcast, now David has this big back catalog of, I think he's about 350 episodes at this point, for people to go and discover whenever they're searching for content about a specific person. So if somebody wants to hear a podcast about Steve Jobs or Walt Disney, and they likely will find one of his episodes, and then they will enjoy it. And so they'll go and look for other episodes. And so very quickly, one person can download dozens or even hundreds of episodes of your podcast. Then they will tell other people about the podcast, who will tell other people about the podcast. And it creates this snowball effect. So that's why content compounds. And, you don't want to delay and wait and get started 5 years from now when you can do things more simply and get started today. All right. And David's second secret is this: don't give up too early. Don't expect results right away. David started on Founders in 2016, but he says that it really didn't start growing until 2019. So it took him 3 years where he had to, just believe in himself when very few people were listening. And it actually wasn't hard in David's case, he says, because he says he would have been doing this, creating these episodes, even if nobody was listening. He never expected Founders to grow like it did. It, doing these episodes, he likes learning, and recording these episodes helped him learn better. It's easy for us to think that everyone else is an overnight success story, right? Because we don't see all the effort that they put in. But the vast majority of successes took years, not days or weeks. And we will hear about some podcasts or some businesses that took off, seemingly overnight. But it's important to remember that that is not the case for 99% of people out there, especially when things get hard. I think, we have to just remember that and keep going. Okay, so it's also important to realize that not every successful podcast has it all figured out. When it comes to founders, and I was thinking about this, there are 3 areas where I think that the show can still improve a lot. The first is social media. So on YouTube, for example, the full-length videos of Founders episodes are just the audio on a black screen, sometimes with captions. Clearly, these videos can be a lot more engaging and compelling, and I think, drive a lot more views. Currently, each of these videos is getting in the, 100, low hundreds of views per episode, which, it is not much at all for a podcast of the size and that's been around this long, and the popularity of something like Founders. The second area I think that Founders can improve, and this one is kind of surprising to me, it doesn't appear that they have an email list or an email newsletter. Email is still the single highest ROI marketing channel, and I think there's a ton of value that Founders could offer in a newsletter format. Plus, it would be another growth channel, one that's more easily shareable than podcasts are. It would help with building community. I think there's room for growth on the community side as well. And it would open up other revenue streams, which brings us to the third area for improvement, and it's around business model. So there are a few different revenue streams that I see on the Founders podcast. One that's noticeably absent is ads. David says, I've heard him say that he doesn't like ads in his podcasts. He doesn't like the way that they interrupt the flow of the podcast. And I can definitely respect that. That is a creative decision. But for one, that's a lot of money being left on the table for a podcast of his size. And I think there are ways that you can make that up that Founders, may not be maximizing. Now, he does some really great things on the revenue front that make a lot of sense for this type of podcast. One, he has Amazon affiliate links for all of the books that he discusses. And that makes a lot of sense. So, you listen to a podcast about, let's say, Steve Jobs, and, David tells you all about the biography. He always says, this is just what he found interesting. You should go out and buy the book because there's a lot of other stuff. And I'm sure a lot of people do that. So whenever they click on one of those links, he gets a small percentage of the price that they pay, and they don't pay anything extra for it. He also sells merch on his website, which is, low effort and probably brings in a little bit of money. But he also has this product called Founders Notes, and from what I can tell, it's like this archive of all of his notes from every podcast episode that he's ever recorded. And he charges a lot for it. He charges $500 a year or $1,500 lifetime for it. And he talks about it at the end of all of his episodes. He just kind of describes what it is. But if you look at his website, I could not find a description of what Founders Notes is, and there's no marketing page for it. There's just a link that says Founders Notes, and you click it, and it's just a sign-in page. So, it was really difficult for me to find out what it was. Is it a community? Is it just information? Is it articles that I can read? I had to go back and listen to the end and like find it in his episode to kind of figure out exactly what it is. And maybe that's the way that he wants it. But I was actually interested in it, and it made it difficult for me to really figure out what it was. And the only reason I point these things out is to show you that, even some of the most successful creators and podcasters still have room for growth and areas that they can improve. And, partially that's because they also have limited resources, right? I don't think they've been doing YouTube for too long at Founders, or I think recently they may have started putting a little bit more effort into it. So people are always experimenting with different growth channels and different strategies and different revenue streams, especially in podcasting. So that's the only reason I call these things out. Okay, I want to talk about the way that David closes his episodes, because I find it really fascinating, and it's become a cool part of his brand, just the way that he ends each episode. If you're a regular listener, it's something you're kind of waiting for every time he's getting close to the end of an episode. And I think when you can do something like that, you have something really cool. So listen to this clip.
And that makes 346 books down, 1,000 to go. And I'll talk to you again soon.
David ends every episode with, X number of books down, 1,000 to go. And it's always 1,000 to go. I guess he always finds another book to replace the one that he just read. But it is, I think it's really like a good way to go. There's no music. Like I said, there's no sound effects, but he still does these little things to help solidify his brand. All right, so now I promised to talk about the things I'm taking away for this podcast, for How Pods Grow, from Founders. Sort of the things that have inspired me, or just the lessons I've learned that I'm going to use on my show. So number one, the show format. I've decided to start How Pods Grow as a solo host style format without interviews. I like the simplicity of this format. I wanted to give it a try. I've never done a podcast like this before. I'd actually love to do interviews at some point on this show. And I think that the content could lend itself very well to an interview format. But I wanted to also get started fast, and this was the best way to do that. So this is the way I've decided to go for now. And people sometimes think that because they started out with a particular format, because they started out as an interview show, or because they started out as a solo show, that has to be their format forever. And that's not true. You can definitely change it up. I've heard some very popular podcasters. One example is Chris Hutchins from All the Hacks. He actually says, so he started out as an interview podcast, and then he decided to do some solo episodes, which I think he wasn't really sure about doing. But he says that those are some of his most popular episodes. So you never know, if you start to grow an audience and people like hearing from you, I definitely think that you can throw in some solo episodes here and there, or switch and do some interviews here and there if you're a solo podcaster. All right, on the name, I wanted to keep it short and simple and self-explanatory so that people knew exactly what they were going to get from the show. So How Pods Grow, it's about how podcasts grow. I'm telling the stories of how some of the most successful podcasts out there grew to where they are today. I think the name will appeal to people who are already interested in podcasts, have their own podcasts, want to grow their podcasts, and that's my target audience. And I'm okay if everyone else just scrolls on by, or doesn't think it looks interesting, because I'm not talking to those people. Number 3, I mentioned how David has no effects or music in his show. And I also mentioned that I think branding is very important, and how music is part of your branding. So for now, you've noticed I don't have any of that in my podcast. It's not because I don't think it's important. Really, it's just because I wanted to get started fast, and I didn't want to have to think about going and finding the right music and effects. So I cut it out for simplicity. I will probably add it in later if it makes sense. But when you're starting a podcast, you have like this checklist of all of the things you have to figure out. You have to think of a name. You have to figure out what your niche is. You have to get cover art created. And you have to come up with your first few episodes. There's a lot of necessary checkboxes. So if there's any that you can cut out because they're not completely necessary, that's the only reason that I did it. One thing that I'm going to do differently from Founders is I'm actually going to release the full video podcasts on YouTube. I've done this before, so I did this with my other show as well, and it actually hasn't been a great traffic source for me, but every podcast is different. Every niche is different, like every subject matter is different, and every show is different. So just because it doesn't work well for one podcast doesn't mean it's not going to work well for another. I've seen plenty of shows where YouTube has been a great driver of traffic and new listeners for the podcast. So I'm going to try it out as an experiment, and I will let you know how that experiment goes. Okay, I want to end by asking you for one favor and telling you about something else that you can take advantage of. So, number one, please go to, so same thing that David did on his podcast, on Founders, on early episodes. Please go to Apple Podcasts and Spotify if you have it, and give How Pods Grow a 5-star rating. It will take you about 10 seconds. There's a link in the show notes to make it even easier for you. Please go and do that. I will really appreciate it. And so the other thing to take advantage of, I will also be sending out short newsletter articles on how pods grow. So if you go to podcharm.com/howpodsgrow, you can sign up for our email list, and you can take advantage of the other resources that I will be sending out about how to grow a podcast and how other successful podcasters have grown theirs.